Have any of you met a woman variant of us?
Sounds terrifying.
Hi, I'm Damien. I'm a genderfluid trans man, and I've never felt more like I wanted to go back into the closet than after the Loki series aired. And if you clicked on this video because you think I'm just going to talk about Sylki, the romantic pairing of Loki and Sylvie, for however many minutes, you're wrong, and I beg you to watch the video all the way through before you comment. I'm going to be talking about the dialogue in the show, the misgendering of the characters, the use of the term sex fluid instead of gender fluid, the comments made by the directors, writers and creative team behind the show, and I'm also going to talk about Sylki. And everyone needs to learn that there is a difference between being what Twitter calls an anti and calling out transphobia. It seems really silly to reduce any criticism of the show, especially when it's about LGBT issues, to being, oh, you didn't like the same fictional couple I like, when there's a difference between a transphobe and a trans person fighting, and someone who ships Stucky and someone who ships Stony fighting. And I would not be criticising the pairing of Loki and Sylvie if it was fanon, but it's canon. There is a difference between not liking a fanon ship because you think it's problematic, and not liking a canon pairing that happened in the show watched by millions of people because it has increased the transphobia thrown at genderfluid people in the fandom. Me not liking the canon couple because I find it fluidphobic is not the same as someone not liking the non-canon ship of Hannibal and Will from the TV series Hannibal because it's unhealthy. I'm not trying to cancel anyone who ships Sylki, and I'm not calling people in the fandom evil. I only want people who haven't or can't recognise transphobia in the show to learn about it and learn why some trans fans are upset. And I want the team behind the show to realise what bad implications it can have when your show is how a lot of cis people learn about transness and gender fluidity. While some trans people may feel comfortable or even empowered with Selfcest, the idea of Selfcest has been pushed by transphobes for years. By which I mean there are a lot of transphobes who push the belief that trans people are just cis men and women who are aroused by the thought of themselves as a different gender. They think that being trans is a fetish. So when I see a team of cis writers write Selfcest for a trans character, I can't help but wonder if there are transphobes on that staff. I'm going to talk about Sylki last, and first talk about the history of Marvel's Loki being gender fluid, and the other bad ways his gender fluidity was handled within the show. And I also want to say here that if you've never heard of or experienced a certain type of degradation or transphobia that I describe here, that doesn't mean these aren't real things that happen and real things that transphobes have said and do say. If you're gender fluid and you've never been told if you're a man and a woman you should just date yourself by a transphobe, I'm very glad you haven't had to experience that. But it doesn't mean all the gender fluid people and trans people who have had that said to them are collectively lying. And if you're cis and you've never heard of these ways that trans people have been degraded, yeah, it's probably because you're not trans. And whether you're trans or cis, the reasonings I will be giving in this video are not made up by myself. They are ideas, beliefs, and derogatory sentences that have existed and been said for years by transphobes. Fiction doesn't affect reality has gotten continually spat back at me as I've talked about this topic for the last few months on Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. And no, fiction doesn't affect reality in terms of liking horror films or Hannibal or problematic ships. But what does affect reality is bad, offensive, and misinformed LGBT representation. That directly increases the amount of homophobia and transphobia in the real world and puts LGBT people in more danger. I've been active in the Marvel fandom for 8 years, and not until the Loki series aired did I have people messaging me to tell me that gender fluidity isn't a real gender and sending me threats. It's not that we need LGBT representation, it's that we need good LGBT representation. I would rather at this point have no LGBT representation, especially from Disney, than bad representation. No representation doesn't put me in more danger for being an out gender fluid person online, and in real life. Oh, and I am fully aware that posting this video will cause me to receive more hate and harassment, as it's already all happened just from me complaining about something as simple as some dialogue choices in the show. So if that is all it took to get people riled up, I can't imagine what this video will cause. But I haven't seen anyone make a video addressing all of the points I want to talk about. Brennan Beckwith made a video that's good and I'd recommend their channel. And while they are trans, they aren't gender fluid, and made their video when only the first couple episodes of the show had aired. Lindsay Ellis made a video about Loki's characterization which didn't touch on his gender identity, and I personally don't believe that Loki has ever been a narcissist in the MCU, and the new writers put that word in without realising it's not just an adjective, but a personality disorder that while Loki shares similarities with, he doesn't really fit into. I think the narcissism is an act he puts on to try and protect himself from getting more trauma, but I'm sidetracked, that's not the point of this video. There are a few smaller creators on here than the likes of Lindsay Ellis who have made videos addressing his gender, and I will link those below, and I may use clips of them in this video. The point is, I'm opening myself up to a lot of angry people here who will disagree with me because it's an important issue that the team behind the show keeps failing to address and ignoring, and there's a lot of people assuming anyone who dislikes the show dislikes it for silly reasons, or that everyone who dislikes the show is harassing the cast. And while I'm sure there are people who've done that, and I know there are people who have harassed the cast and crew, there was a whole group of trans people talking calmly about the ways that they saw transphobia in the show, and the fandom keeps shutting them down and labelling them antis as if the only problem with the show is this romantic ship, when there are multiple issues, which makes more people think anyone who dislikes the show is doing it over some petty ship drama, and I hate the idea of calling transphobia fandom drama. And if you all love Loki so much, you should want better representation for them, and trying to silence queer voices by telling everyone else in the cast and the crew we're just silly, bitter aunties who are mad Loki didn't get to kiss a boy is just a straight up lie. And most of the time when people say this, they are misgendering Loki, because if he had kissed Mobius or any other male character, that isn't two men or two cis men kissing. And it just makes me think about those few Loki fangirls who are super transphobic and convinced that the Marvel Cinematic Universe Loki is cisgendered and heterosexual, and saw the show as vindication for those beliefs. It's never good when the transphobes in the fandom think you proved Loki wasn't trans in your show where you said you were going to finally prove that Loki is actually trans. And I need to state that all of this is obviously my opinion, and the opinions of many other genderfluid people that I have interacted with, but not all genderfluid people. I've gotten accused of speaking for all genderfluid people by people who think there is nothing wrong with the show, and interestingly, mostly by cishet people who think there's nothing wrong with the show. And I feel like it should be obvious that not all genderfluid people are some hive mind who all have the same opinions. There are some genderfluid people who aren't bothered by the same things I am. However, there are a lot of genderfluid people who are bothered about things in the show, and if you're choosing to listen to the one genderfluid person you saw who likes Sylki over the 20 people you saw who said they feel hurt by it, that's not being a good ally. It shouldn't take 100% of genderfluid people to call the show transphobic for you to think there's a problem with it. Even if the split in the fandom is 50-50, that's still not good. 50% of the people thinking the show is transphobic is not good. But disclaimer, which I also put earlier in the video, other genderfluid people will have different opinions than I do. That doesn't make their opinions less valid, and it doesn't make my opinions less valid. If you're a genderfluid and you aren't offended by some of the things that I am offended by, that's okay. I don't want you and other genderfluid people to be more upset than you are, but I would hope you understand where I'm coming from and can have some empathy. I know of genderfluid people who have enjoyed the show and have been harassed and accused of fetishizing and faking being genderfluid. I know of genderfluid people who watch the show with their parents and haven't come out to their parents yet and were going to and thought the show would be a tool to help them do that, and instead their parents watched the show with them and made fun of Loki's genderfluidity because of how it was presented in the show, and now they feel like they can't come out to their parents. That's not okay. The takeaway from this video should be not to harass any genderfluid people, whether they like the show or not, and also, I do not condone the harassing of the cast or crew of the show. I encourage people to share their opinions and feelings about it, and I would love the team behind the show to address the calm criticism of the show, but sending them threats, sending anyone threats, is never okay. I want to remind everyone that while the director is bisexual and Sophia Di Martino, who plays Sylvie, has dated both men and women and has described her sexuality as fluid, that doesn't mean they are exempt from being transphobic. I'm also not accusing them or anyone else of being a transphobe, but at the very least they are ignorant about trans issues and should have consulted genderfluid people or even hired genderfluid writers before trying to write a genderfluid character. But let's get into it. If you've never read the comics nor know anything about them, you may not know that Loki has been canonically genderfluid and bi or pansexual since 2013. Loki being genderfluid in the Marvel comics is based on the original Norse mythology, where Loki has been described as being male and female. But before anyone talks about the horse situation, I need to remind you that the Norse myths are not necessarily great genderfluid or LGBT representation. Loki is described as female whenever he is submissive to a man sexually. That's not great LGBT rep and is a little bit homophobic. But we must remember that Myth Loki and Marvel Loki are two different beings. As well as being LGBT in the comics, Marvel's Loki has also been canonically genderfluid and bi-pan in the Avengers Academy mobile game, in the novel, which opens up a whole other can of worms about the author, but the point is he's canonically genderfluid and bi or pan in that book as well. And while mentioning the horse in the mythology, please do not ever use that as proof that Loki is genderfluid or bi or pansexual. Equating bestiality with queerness is disgusting. But as well as the comics, Tom Hiddleston has said for years that he sees his Loki as genderfluid and bi or pan.
LA Week has recently announced that he's doing a Loki comic that is just about Loki and his things, and he announced now that Loki is actually bisexual and can transform into
Yeah, I
a
heard
woman.
that. I heard that.
How was your reaction to that?
I think it's great. I think, you know, Loki's a shapeshifter, I guess, and it also means that he can be, that everybody can empathize with him, you know? It means that he's, that there's no box he fits into, and it means he appeals to everybody, and I think the more that happens in life, the better.
And also ambiguous. He's not even gendered, really. He can be a man or a woman.
I remember you telling me that.
Yeah. There's a lady Loki, there's a kid Loki, there's
Yeah.
he's pansexual in some extraordinary way.
And I keep saying bi or pan because both labels have been used for Loki by people who have worked on Loki media, and there are real people who use both labels, so instead of fighting over whether bi or pan is Loki's label, he very likely could use both. There are real people who use both. No, they don't always mean the same thing, but they can overlap, and it's totally okay to use both labels. Stop accusing each other of erasing his sexuality by calling him bi or pan. All we know so far is that he has been described as both, so we can assume that he uses both labels. Have I felt empowered by this representation in the comics? Yes. I adore Loki not only because I fixated on him as a way to help cope with things I was going through at the time, but he is the only reason that I accepted and learnt that I am gender fluid. So that representation in the comics means a hell of a lot to me. But is it good representation? Not really. Sadly, Loki falls into the horrible trope for gender fluid characters of making them shapeshifters. This wouldn't be a problem if Loki was Marvel's only gender fluid shapeshifter, but Marvel Comics has 4 different gender fluid characters, and all of them are shapeshifters. This is bad gender fluid representation because many people believe that to be gender fluid, you have to be a shapeshifter, and therefore it's an identity that can only exist in fiction, as shapeshifters don't exist in the real world. It also carries a very transmed ideology. Transmed or transmedicalism is the belief that to be trans, you have to have had surgery or be taking hormones, or currently be aiming for that, but how can anyone really tell if you're saving up money for that? No one can tell by looking at you if you've had surgery or you want surgery. And transmeds are trans people who have these beliefs. If you think that in order for Loki to be a woman, she must have shapeshifted into having breasts and a vagina, that is fluidphobic. That is transphobic. Loki could have Tom Hiddleston's body, not a cis female actor playing him, not Tom with CGI'd breasts and softer facial features, and still be a woman. It's also an overused, harmful trope to have gender fluid and non-binary characters be non-human, whether they be aliens or robots. It's not harmful for there to be non-binary aliens, but when the only non-binary characters are all aliens, that's not good representation. It makes them seem like something other and not human.
Now on the surface, this is just a fun little trend we might notice, right? Like, ooh, interesting, very sci-fi, very cool. But there's something running deeper here. And it's about the question of what we see as human. Because a lot of these elements of representation won't come from a desire to represent non-binary or gender fluid characters, but instead a desire to make a non-human character as non-human as possible, to make them strange and different and alien. And having them be non-binary is one of those tactics, because it's part of the way that non-binary people are often perceived. This then becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. If most or all non-binary representation that people see is in human characters, it doesn't exactly do much to change the attitude. It has the potential to be incredibly othering, making characters seem less human. At its extremes, othering can lead to an attitude that a group is less human or less deserving of equality or respect than the more powerful or accepted in-group.
But to come back to whether Tom Hiddleston should or would have breasts CGI'd onto him or softer facial features if Loki were to present as a woman, that touches on the whole grossness and gender essentialism of a lot of these edits where people Photoshop Tom's face to look like a woman, which is just weird to Photoshop someone else's face anyway, I think, but also plays into gender essentialism. Gender essentialism is the idea that men and women have certain physical features and qualities that are unique to men and women. Now, I don't find anything inherently wrong or transphobic with gender bending. However, this is a canon gender fluid character, and it's hurtful to see people think he would only be female when looking like this, when having longer hair, softer facial features, bigger lips, bigger eyes, shorter, more curves, like all of that is gender essentialism. You do not need to fit into any of those categories to be a woman, whether cis or trans. Loki is not only Lady Loki when he looks like that. And speaking of the term Lady Loki, please don't use it. It's a term that has never been used in the comics. It has never been a canon term used in the comics. I know you might think that it was, because of how often the fandom says it, but it wasn't. It was first used by the fandom to describe Loki when he was possessing Sif's body, but that is not gender fluidity. Loki is still male there, he's just possessing a woman's body. That is not Loki's body. He even calls himself a man while he's in Sif's body. This is Loki presenting as female, and she has never called herself Lady Loki. The term is harmful to some gender fluid people for the same reason as the edits I just talked about. How do you know when to call Loki Lady Loki? How do you know just by looking at them whether they're female? When they have breasts? Sorry to break the news, but a gender fluid person can have a flat chest and be female and have breasts and be male. In fact, those rules apply to any trans person. Your body and your pronouns and your genitalia do not dictate your gender. Loki in the comics is actually canonically comfortable with any and all pronouns regardless of how they're presenting. So even saying, oh well, he only goes by he, him pronouns here, so he must be a man here, is not true for Loki because canonically he goes by any pronouns. In the 2019 Loki comics, Tony Stark asks him essentially what his pronouns are, and Loki says that he is good with any of them. And at that time, Tony assumed at first Loki was male because he is in a stereotypically male presenting body, but Loki said he's fine with any pronouns. Before anyone says there was no queerbaiting, Loki was bisexual. If someone says a character is going to be on-screen trans and bi, and then only show them as bi, that is still queerbaiting. It's still queerbaiting even though he was canonically bisexual, because they promised gender fluid representation, and then they didn't say that he was gender fluid or show that he was gender fluid. I've seen people say no one should complain about Loki not being gender fluid because he was bi and shouldn't we all be happy about that? But in multiple interviews with different news outlets, Tom Hiddleston, Kate Herron, the director, and Michael Waldron, the head writer, all boasted about the gender fluid representation they were going to put in the show. Waldron has been the most egregious in this, stating that he doesn't feel qualified to talk about gender fluidity, while boasting about how great the representation that his cis team of writers led by him, a cis man, have written. If he didn't feel qualified to talk about gender fluidity in interviews, why did he feel qualified enough to write a show with a lead gender fluid character? I do not believe that one single gender fluid person was consulted on any part of the show. I'm aware the director is bisexual, but that doesn't change anything. Cisgendered people who are straight or queer can still be transphobic and can still be ignorant to what constitutes as transphobia. The team behind the show have overall just really frustrated me. And I'll get into some of the ridiculous things they've said during and after the show aired throughout this video. And also this isn't to do with gender fluid representation, but I just wanted to mention somewhere that Waldron once joked about not seeing the Thor films until very recently before being hired on Loki, and we all knew he was joking. And I do still believe he was joking, but then recently he stated, while being 100% serious, that Loki has trauma because Odin killed Laufey, and he had to watch his adoptive father kill his birth father. That is not true. In Thor 1, Odin does not kill Laufey, Loki kills Laufey. Just thought it was weird and I wanted to mention that somewhere. Maybe that's why half of Loki's trauma never got addressed in the show. Maybe the writers didn't even know that it happened. Also, there's that one tweet where Eric Martin, another writer on the show, complained that he was told he had to focus the Loki series on Loki. There are some other weird things they've all said that kind of contradict each other, and it just really feels like none of them consulted each other, like the writers, the directors, the composer, like none of them talked while they were making the show, but I'll mention those in more detail later. Should we have expected better from Disney? No, not really. But I also didn't expect them to straight up lie that hard. Before, when they've queerbaited, they've said things like, Avengers Endgame will have Marvel's first gay character, and it's a minor character played by one of the directors who briefly refers to his date as he, so quickly that you could absolutely miss it. But technically, as much as that was queerbaiting, they technically didn't lie. They said, this film will have Marvel's first gay character, and it did. They technically never promised that that character would be a main character. But in Loki, they promised that the lead character would be gender fluid on screen. They promised that specifically, and they didn't deliver. That is the hardest that I've ever seen Disney lie about their queerbaiting.
Loki's screenwriter refers to the character's gender identity. It was important to us. Was it? Yeah, was it important to you? Then why not have Loki actually say it? Or at the very least, have this piece of paper be on screen for more than 1 second, you know, if it's that important to you.
And while this video is about Loki's gender fluid representation and not about the bisexual representation, I do want to add and make clear that the bisexual representation in this show is also not amazing. Yes, Loki is canonically bisexual now. There are still people trying to argue that he isn't, but that is a fact that Loki in the MCU is canonically bisexual. But the reveal and representation is still not good. Just as I said with the gender fluid representation being blink and you'll miss it being a word on a piece of paper, the one throwaway line is also just very rainbow capitalism and very woke points, you know? I'm glad they included it, and I was happy when he said that, but it's still not great representation. This video is obviously just talking about his gender fluidity, but if you want to watch a video looking at the bisexual representation in the Loki series, I can highly recommend Verily Bitchy's video, Commodifying Bi Validation, Loki vs Russell T Davies. If you don't know who Russell T Davies is, he made some comments on how pathetic he found the bisexual representation in Loki.
Netflix and Disney Plus especially, I think that's a very great worry where, you know, Loki makes one reference to being bisexual once and everyone's like, oh my god, it's like a pansexual show. It's like one word. He said the word prince. And we're all meant to go, thank you, Disney. Aren't you marvellous? It's pathetic.
He's a writer who is best known for bringing back Doctor Who. He was the head writer on the Christopher Eccleston and David Tennant seasons of Doctor Who, and was in charge and created the spin-offs Torchwood and the Sarah Jane Adventures. He's an openly gay man. He's been writing queer characters in queer shows since before he worked on Doctor Who, such as Queer as Folk, the original UK version, which was then adapted to the USA show, also called Queer as Folk. And with Doctor Who, he introduced Jack Harkness, which was definitely the first LGBT character of any kind that I saw on TV growing up. And it's done so casually. There was never any fanfare. Granted, this was 2005, but there was never any big press about that there was going to be a queer character in the show. Jack was just bi, and I use that as an all-encompassing, he could be bi or pan or omni. He never uses a label in the show. And it's just accepted. None of the characters find it's strange. It's just how he is, and there's never any big deal made of it. But I won't be going into depth about the bisexual representation here. I just wanted to mention it somewhere, so I'm mentioning it here. If you want a video, please go check out Verily Bitchy's video.
Meanwhile, in 2021, 20 years after Davis started bringing all these bisexual characters into mainstream British television, after 25 Marvel Cinematic Universe films and dozens of TV spin-offs, Marvel Studios, owned by, of course, Disney, had the bravery to portray this.
A bit of both.
Oh, so brave. Brings a tear to my eye, honestly. No, but seriously, executive producer Kate Herron made a point of saying that it was really important to bring that to the character, and in some ways, it's a massive scene. It's a huge step. And I think Kate Herron did that with the absolute best of intentions, and I don't fault her. But it's only huge and massive and important in the context of a really lazy franchise which just doesn't give a crap.
I just didn't want anyone to watch this video and think that I'm only critiquing the gender fluid representation, when there's still plenty to critique about the bisexual representation, and I don't want anyone to think that the bi rep was amazing. It was just there. It was one line, and then the team behind the show confirmed that it won't be brought up again, ever. That could just mean for the rest of season 1, it could also mean for however many more seasons of Loki they're going to do. I don't know how much I trust that it will get brought up again, when the only reason it was probably mentioned in the first place is because the director is bisexual and she wanted to have somewhere where Loki mentioned he was bi. But we all know that Marvel doesn't care. Disney don't care. That one line can easily be snipped out of the show for when they want to broadcast it in more conservative countries.
I received a comment on my last video talking about how this person watched the whole episode of Loki with their parents, who completely missed the bi reference and didn't even follow it after it was explained to them, leaving this person to wonder if this even happened.
But I don't think anyone should expect anything better of Disney or Marvel, and I don't want anyone to think that they secretly really tried, or they secretly really wanted to do more and they couldn't, because I think about this tweet a lot. I say tweet, it's a quote from an actual interview and article that was official on Marvel's page. Loki's gender fluidity is, quote, not a big deal, according to Marvel Studios EVP of Production Victoria Alfonso. Quote, it is what it is when it suits the character. In the comics, this is who he was. End quote. Loki still is gender fluid in the comics. I do not know why past tense was used there. It is what it is when it suits the character. I'm sorry, I didn't know trans people can only be trans when it suits them. I think all trans people of any kind, non-binary, gender fluid, I know for me personally, if I am only gender fluid when it suits me, well, it suits me all of the time. Being trans isn't a choice. It's not a suit that we put on when we want to feel fancy. It suits Loki all the time to be gender fluid. Because he is. And I don't want anyone saying, oh, she probably said it's not a big deal, as in, we shouldn't be making a big deal of someone's gender, it should just be normal. Do you honestly think an executive at Marvel is actually, like, open to gender fluid people? They're saying it's not a big deal as a way to never have to mention it again. They can play off, oh, we didn't make a bigger deal of his gender fluidity in the show because it's just a normal thing. It shouldn't have to be made a big deal of. That is a poor excuse. What she's saying here is that in the comics, Loki is well suited to be gender fluid, but in the MCU, he's just not suited to be gender fluid. Now, whether that means that she thinks that Loki doesn't act queer enough, which is a whole issue because there's no one way that queer people act. You shouldn't be looking at someone and be trying to figure out if they're queer or not based on how they act or how they dress. Is that what she's getting at? Because I swear I've heard other people say similar things, people who've worked on other shows that they've adapted and taken queer characters and not kept them as queer, because they've been like, oh, well, it just didn't feel right, or it just didn't suit what we wanted to go for. There's no excuse. When you say things like that, what it sounds like is, you don't like queer people, you don't like queer characters, you don't think they're worth representing, you somehow think it would be a pain or more of a task, or take more work to show queer characters. It doesn't. That you're worried about whether the representation you do will be controversial, and so you just can't be bothered. You can't be bothered to have to do the tiny extra bit of research you would have to do. You can't be bothered to hire any queer writers. It's just being ignorant and lazy. There's no excuse for saying, oh, we didn't want to make Loki gender fluid all the time because it doesn't suit him. A gender fluid person is always gender fluid, even if in that moment they're identifying as their birth gender. Just as a bisexual man is always bisexual even if they're currently dating a woman. If Marvel really wanted to accept gender fluid Loki, they could easily just have Loki switch pronouns throughout the show. They don't have to have him shapeshift, and in fact it would be even better representation if they had him identifying as different genders while not having shapeshifted. That would be representation that fell into less harmful stereotypes for gender fluid people. And it would be such a tiny thing to just refer to Loki as they, them in a couple scenes. And you know what? I'm sure a lot of people would gloss over it if you're worried about what the cis fans think. But they can't even do that. Before the Loki series came out, we saw this picture of a file and a promotional video, and the fandom exploded in excitement. Loki was finally going to be gender fluid in the show to match up with what has been canon in the comics since 2013. The file says sex::fluid. Not gender fluid, sex::fluid. And at the time, everyone still celebrated, and I'll admit, despite me not liking that it said sex instead of gender, as those are two different things, I was excited. I remember messaging my friends and them being excited for me because they knew how much Loki's gender fluid representation meant to me. I was a fool. After the series came out, a lot of people started taking away that colon and merging the two words into one word and calling Loki sex fluid, and saying that he wasn't gender fluid, he was sex fluid, and telling gender fluid fans that they were wrong to call Loki gender fluid. Sex and gender are not the same things. Sex is what genitalia you have, it's your biology, whereas gender is a social construct and is what you identify as. Sex fluid is not a real thing, it's not a real term. And I've been told, well, duh, it's a fictional show. Sex fluid isn't real, but neither is Loki. I don't know about you, but I think it's important to use the correct pronouns, genders, and sexualities for people, even if they are fictional people. But also it is way beyond just being fictional when people say sex fluid is a real identity, and gender fluid isn't. Calling Loki sex fluid has become a way to erase the fact that he's gender fluid, and erases the gender fluid label from one of the very few gender fluid characters in existence, and the only gender fluid character in a major franchise. Sex fluid is such a disgusting, harmful word as well, and it's also just plain incorrect. It's transphobic to use sex fluid as an explanation of his gender, as it implies one's genitalia has to change in order to be a different gender, because that's what sex means. It's your genitalia. It means his genitalia is fluid and changes. And as I've stated already, your genitalia does not signify your gender, despite there being some trans people who believe that. You can be trans and not get surgery. And of course, for the case of real gender fluid people, we cannot shapeshift our genitalia every other day. Loki is not gender fluid because he's a shapeshifter. He just happens to be both, which is like the ultimate dream of every gender fluid person to be able to shapeshift.
Like the demon from It Follows can shapeshift, you know? Sometimes it's an old woman, like sometimes it's a very tall man. Is the demon from It Follows a gender fluid icon, you know? Is that LGBT representation?
Which is why it's also just an incorrect term to use on a factual Loki level, not just on an offensive level. Loki was assigned male at birth, not fluid. He was assigned male at birth, and then learnt how to shapeshift as he grew up. Ludin found this little baby frost giant and thought that is a man based on what genitalia Loki had. They would have put his sex down as male. He was gender fluid since he was born, but he wasn't born a shapeshifter. Loki shapeshifts as a way of lying and tricking people, but when he's a different gender, shapeshifted or not, that isn't a lie. In fact, in the Agent of Asgard comics, there's a scene with Verity, a character who has the power to see through every lie to the point where she can't even enjoy fiction, who could not tell that a woman was Loki because it wasn't a lie. She can sense every lie and she could not tell that this woman was Loki because she'd never seen Loki in a female form before, but she could not see through it that was Loki because it wasn't a lie. It wasn't a trick or disguise. Loki was being herself. Verity didn't know that the woman in the flashback was Loki until Loki told her. And when Verity acts confused because Loki can't trick her, she can't be tricked, she can see through every lie, Loki's like, well, of course, because I'm not anyone else though, I'm not lying, I'm just being me. I've also seen too many people saying he's sex fluid or gender fluid because he turned into a female horse in the mythology. I mentioned this myth earlier, but for anyone not familiar, in the original Norse mythology there is a myth where Loki transforms into a female horse and engages in intimate activity with a male horse and ends up becoming pregnant and giving birth to an 8-legged horse. Other than myth Loki being a different being from Marvel Loki, please stop equating queerness with bestiality. Transforming into a horse is not being gender fluid. Having sex with a horse is not being bisexual or pansexual. I have seen too many allies thinking that they're having amazing pro-LGBT takes by replying to people who go, Loki's not bi, that's disgusting, by saying, yeah he is, and he always has been, he fucked a horse, remember? And thinking that they're trying to advocate for pansexuality, when in fact the idea that pan people fuck animals is something that has been used against pan people by bigots for years. And the implication that anyone who is attracted to multiple genders would also fuck animals is extremely biphobic and panphobic. And I've seen so many people saying that they don't like that Loki, the director, called Loki bi because, well, obviously he's pan, because he fucked a horse. That's more like pan people, not bi people, don't you think? Which is so disgusting. No, it's not. It's in fact not like bi people or pan people to do that, actually. Using bestiality as a takedown against people who say Loki isn't canonically bi is not the amazing pro-LGBT ally point that you think it is. And even if this file had said gender fluid, I hope you know that one word on a file that was in the first second of one Twitter and Instagram promo video before the show came out, and was also on screen for a couple of seconds in episode 1, would not have been good representation. Even if it had said gender fluid, that is not the amazing representation that they bragged about in interviews. It's blink and you'll miss it representation. There are multiple instances of characters getting their pronouns and genders invalidated in this show. The first instance we get is in episode 2, where despite knowing that Sylvie is either female or gender fluid, Mobius and the TVA call her he.
Because whoever this variant is, we haven't been able to find him, so let's bring in an expert.
It's a trap. He's waiting for you outside this tent.
Should I secure the research charges?
No, he wants me. I'm the key to his plan. He knows that I'm stronger than him.
Almost one unit.
And he rightly believes that together we can overthrow and rule the TVA. Knowing what I now know about his tactics, the variant could be hiding in the apocalypse and do whatever he wants, and we wouldn't know. That's where he is.
Now, I could accept that this is for the sake of making the reveal that the other Loki is a woman a surprise for the audience, but hear me out. It shouldn't be surprising for the audience for a Loki to be a woman. That should just be normal. I know not every Marvel Cinematic Universe fan is familiar with the comics and knew that Loki was gender fluid before then, but a fair amount of them did. And it definitely wouldn't be surprising to Loki, but it shouldn't be surprising to Mobius if he's studied Loki his entire life. But it shouldn't really be surprising to us. It shouldn't be portrayed as surprising to the audience when this is just a normal fact about Loki. And while our main Loki didn't know what gender the other Loki was, or what gender the Loki was going to be presenting as, the TVA knew, and still used the wrong pronouns. In episode 4, we get Mobius calling Sylvie Loki's female self, and if that doesn't tell you that the writers did not care about making Loki gender fluid, I don't know what will.
I'm telling you the truth, she's not my girlfriend.
Whatever you want to call her. You're your female self that you have some demented crush on.
You're all variants!
Sylvie is not Loki's female self. Loki is their own female self. Loki could be female right now in this scene, sitting across this table from Mobius. Loki does not owe anyone a pair of breasts or longer hair or lipstick in order to be female. Neither does any gender fluid person or character. Loki could be female at any point in the show, and as previously stated, goes by any pronouns no matter what gender they're presenting as, so could be going by he, him, and still be a woman. I think about this panel that I brought up earlier from Loki 2019 where Tony Stark checks in on Loki's pronouns, despite that Loki hasn't shapeshifted out of his assigned male at birth body, because Stark knows that just because Loki has male genitalia doesn't mean he's a man right now. Also, the idea that Loki is falling in love with his female self falls into the extremely transphobic belief of autogynephilia that I will discuss more in detail when we get onto the final section of this video, talking about the romantic couple in this series. But to quickly explain it here first, is the transphobic belief that trans women aren't really women, they are just men who are aroused by the thought of themselves as a woman. And here we have Mobius telling Loki that he is attracted to himself as a woman. Mobius right here is telling Loki that he has autogynephilia. I think this is more likely written out of ignorance than malicious transphobia, but it doesn't make it any better. They are writers being hired by $1 billion company. The least they could do is research what to avoid when writing trans characters. If they didn't want to do that, they should have just not made Loki gender fluid in this show. They shouldn't have ever talked about in interviews that he was going to be gender fluid. No one made them make him gender fluid in the MCU. It's like they said it just to get buzz going about the show and just to get woke points, but didn't actually want to follow through with it. Or hell, maybe they even said it in interviews after the show came out, knowing that they didn't actually film any of that. And finally, we get this scene that I played in the opening of this video from episode 5.
Have any of you met a woman variant of us?
Sounds terrifying.
Loki describes Sylvie as a woman version of us, despite the fact that Loki themselves is a woman, and that these variants in the room with him are also all likely women. And before anyone says that just because main Loki is gender fluid doesn't mean all the Loki variants are, at least some of them are canonically 100% for a fact gender fluid, and I can prove that, but even though the rest are more up to speculation, why would you be against them all being gender fluid? Why would that be something that you would not want to be true? As for me proving that some of them are canonically gender fluid, our main Loki from the show is gender fluid, right? We know this. But he is a Loki who branched off, took an alternate future from the Loki from the films, meaning the Loki in the films is also gender fluid. So because film Loki is gender fluid, any Loki variant that comes from his timeline that is just Thor 1, Thor Ragnarok, Infinity War, or Endgame, or Dark World Loki, but with an alternate future, is also gender fluid, right? Any film version of Loki with an alternate future is also gender fluid because they came from this same film Loki and just sprouted off a different path. There are 3 Lokis who sprouted off from our main film MCU Loki. That is the main Loki in the Loki series, that is President Loki, and that is Classic Loki, who managed to successfully fake his death in front of Thanos and run off. President Loki, Classic Loki are canonically gender fluid. So then explain to me why Loki says that being a woman is different from what they are to Classic Loki. Explain to me why Classic Loki is the one who says being a woman sounds terrifying. I saw someone say maybe it's because Classic Loki is old, and old people are more transphobic because they don't know any better, and what? Classic Loki's not some elderly human. Classic Loki is film Loki from the future. He's lived in our current time period on Earth, and he's not even from Earth, he's from Asgard, which, in the comics at least, canonically has never had the concept of homophobia and transphobia because being queer on Asgard has always been normal and accepted. So Classic Loki wouldn't even have the concept of transphobia. And Richard E. Grant even seems to be on board with the idea of his Loki being gender fluid.
Unlike Tom Hiddleston's Loki, which is always He's the god of mischief. What I loved about the old Loki script in episode 5 that I got to do is that he says he's the god of outcasts. And anybody who's been disenfranchised or felt not included or discriminated against or gender fluidly prejudiced against in whatever shape or form, I thought anybody who has been an outsider at any point in their life, and I certainly felt that and identify with that.
And I don't know why people are even trying to argue why a fictional character said a transphobic line of dialogue and trying to defend why classic Loki or TVA Loki said this. Stop trying to justify or find a reason why a character you like, whether it's classic Loki or Mobius or TVA Loki, said a transphobic line, and remember that they are not real. Their dialogue is not their thoughts, it is the thought of real, cis writers who wrote that dialogue for them. The writers are the ones who need to explain themselves, not the characters. Heron actually addressed this in an interview, or, well, she made out like she did, but then talked about what boastful Loki and Kid Loki's reactions were, but completely did not talk about the line that classic Loki says, where he says being a woman sounds terrifying. Classic Loki's line there is sort of the worst line of dialogue, but so is main Loki's line of questioning whether any of them have seen a woman version of them before when he himself is a woman version of himself. Heron never actually addressed the actual 2 lines of dialogue everyone was complaining about, especially classic Loki's line, and instead talked about 2 different characters who no one had complained about. No one had been complaining about what boastful and Kid Loki's reactions were to this scene. And also her reasoning why they reacted badly, which they didn't react at all. I don't know if she's misremembering the scene or if she's just trying to dodge the question and not admit that what they wrote was transphobic, but she says the reason why they reacted badly was because maybe they're not gender fluid, and maybe Kid Loki's like too young to know he's gender fluid. I don't like when cis people feel the need to separate child characters from queerness. It kind of has this underlying idea that they think that queerness is something sexual, and that's why it shouldn't be associated with child characters. But also I hate the fact that she opened the door for maybe not all Lokis are gender fluid, because of course so many people jumped on that as a reason to say why every single Loki, even the main Loki, isn't gender fluid. Sylvie Laufey-Daughter from the Loki series is a character based on 2 different characters from the comics who've been combined. Fans of the comics or cartoons will probably have heard of Amora the Enchantress.
Enchantress? What are you doing, Amora? You are an Asgardian, not some lackey to a mortal villain.
Zemo is but a toy, to be discarded when I tire of him.
What do you want?
You, of course. Always been my heart's desire. We could leave Midgard and Asgard behind, and we could be together.
She first appeared in the Marvel Comics back in 1964, and is an Asgardian who is in love with Thor, often using her magic to hypnotize him into loving her back, and is very friendly with Loki. She's had romances with Scourge the Executioner, and fans thought she might make an appearance in Thor Ragnarok, but she sadly didn't. She's currently alive in the comics and most recently appeared in the Captain Marvel comics back in the summer. She's an extremely powerful sorceress who, as well as appearing in the comics, has been in multiple animated shows like Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, Avengers Assemble, and Hulk vs. Thor, and in video games like Ultimate Alliance, the LEGO Marvel Superheroes 2, and Avengers Academy. The closest we've got to seeing Amora in the MCU is by seeing her sister Lorelei in Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Amora and Loki have sort of danced around each other. Normally they're just very good friends, but there have been occasional times when they've been portrayed more like love interests. Sylvie Lushton is a more recent Marvel comic character. She first made her appearance in 2009 as an average human girl living in Oklahoma, when one day the Asgardians moved in nearby and she awoke with magical powers. These powers were given to her by Loki for not really any reason other than to see if he could. It's implied that Loki completely created Sylvie and her memories of being a human child are entirely fabricated. She took up the name and appearance of Amora the Enchantress and began pretending to be Asgardian. No one knows the extent of her powers, and they may be tied to Loki's life force, as when Loki gets ill, Sylvie also gets ill. She had a small run with the Young Avengers before switching sides, then joining the Doom Maidens and being banished by the real Amora the Enchantress for using her name and identity. Amora said they could become friends if Sylvie survived, but that was in 2016 and Sylvie has never been seen or heard from in the comics since. Perhaps at first the Loki series had the idea of using the beloved character of Amora, but for some reason they instead decided to take the name Sylvie from Sylvie Lushton and just give it to a variant of Loki. I have no idea why they made Sylvie an alternate universe version of Loki when Sylvie Lushton was basically Loki's daughter in the comics, which led to a lot of people suspecting that Sylvie Laufey-daughter in the show was going to be revealed as Loki's daughter. And in fact, even Eric Martin, one of the writers, was liking these tweets about Sylvie being Loki's daughter at the same time he was liking tweets about Sylvie and Loki kissing and having an orgy. Amora and Loki in the comics have had their flirtations, but they aren't related to each other in any way. I cannot fathom why they made her a Loki variant in the show, unless they just wanted to make a female-presenting Loki, and then thought they didn't want to use the name Loki for her, as if she was a love interest. It would be too confusing if they were both called Loki, and also might be too weird for fans to handle if they were both called Loki, so they just gave her the name Sylvie as a nod to Sylvie Lushton in the comics. But maybe that's just what Sylvie Laufey-daughter is. A Loki variant with random references to the comics without any thought that the name Sylvie is a character that is likely Loki's daughter, and a headdress that actually has significant personal meaning to Loki in the comics, but no, let's just slap the one-horned helmet onto Sylvie in the show. I know there are fans of the show who headcanon Sylvie as a trans woman, and I love those headcanons, but it isn't canon. In fact, Sofia Di Martino has said that Sylvie has nothing to do with gender fluidity. I don't know if that's because she personally doesn't want Sylvie to, she doesn't see Sylvie as trans in any way, or the writers have told her that Sylvie is not trans in any way. It's not an unfounded headcanon for Sylvie to be trans, given that she gave herself a new name and doesn't want to be called by her birth name Loki, or be associated with who she was born to be. But I don't think that was done as a parallel to trans people having dead names. I don't think it was done for the sake of queer representation. I think it was done to distance her from Loki as much as possible, in order to try and make the romance between them seem less weird. There is nothing wrong with headcanoning Sylvie as a trans woman, and trans people finding her empowering, that's great. But just please remember that her being trans has never been confirmed by the cast and crew, and in fact the only mention we've ever had of Sylvie's gender is that she isn't trans. Or at least isn't gender fluid. Would I love her to be gender fluid? Absolutely. I think she should be gender fluid, as I think all Loki variants should be gender fluid, and are gender fluid. But I personally hate the theory that Sylvie's Nexus event was her identifying as a woman and becoming trans, because that plays into the idea that she used to be cis and then one day decided she was trans, and that's when the TVA came for her. No one suddenly decides to be trans, they just are trans, and sure, they have a day where they realise or understand that they are trans, or it takes years slowly over time, but no one has just one random moment where they're like, yep, I'm trans now, for the TVA to come and take them away. There's also a lot of people who think that Sylvie is just the director's self-insert character, and I don't know about that, but I just thought that was an interesting point to mention, at least, because it is something I've seen a lot of people saying. And then if Sylvie was trans and Loki is her dead name, why was official merchandise calling her Lady Loki, a term I've already covered earlier in this video? But Sylvie isn't canonically trans, as it's basically been confirmed by the actor who plays her, and by the director saying that the only Loki confirmed to be trans is the main Loki played by Tom Hiddleston. And this is Disney we're talking about. If Sylvie was trans, they would have been boasting about her representation, about how amazing they were for having a trans character in their show. You inferring Sylvie as trans does not equal actual trans representation in the show, nor does it mean that interpretation of the character was intended by the writers.
There are definitely various queer metaphorical readings you could make of Loki, the TVA and the time loop punishment as a kind of conversion therapy, plucking those that deviate from the natural norm out of the sacred timeline, which is then revealed to be a sham, for example. But just because you can see the reading doesn't mean it was deliberately put there by the mouse. Don't get me wrong, I am so ready to see gender fluid representation in this kind of high budget show. But there's part of me that's not super excited to see what a team that potentially mixed up sex, gender and sexuality would do with an attempt at in-depth and realistic gender fluid representation.
And yes, Sylvie Laufey-daughter in the show is a Loki variant. I've seen so many people who love Sylvie and love Sylvie with Loki talk about how Sylvie isn't actually a Loki, so it isn't Selfcest. I've seen them claim that any Loki who isn't played by Tom Hiddleston, like Boastful Loki for example, isn't actually a Loki variant. That's never been up for debate. That's not something to have a theory about whether it's canon or not. That's like trying to argue that Steve Rogers isn't Captain America. Yes, Sylvie goes by a different name, and yes, Boastful Loki is played by a different actor, but they are still Loki variants. Sylvie having a different name and having a different hair colour still makes her a Loki. I can only think these changes were done to try and distance her likeness from Loki and Tom so it wouldn't feel as weird when they got together. Could you imagine how many more people would be uncomfortable if they called each other Loki and looked very similar in appearance and then kissed? Can you imagine how many people would be uncomfortable if they CGI'd a female-looking Tom Hiddleston and had him kiss her? And how come when Loki gets in a romantic relationship, it's with the only one who's changed their name and their physical appearance more? Sylvie herself says it's an alias, and He Who Remains calls her Loki. While classic Loki and Kid Loki both bring up their Thors, Sylvie does not, as if maybe they knew Sylvie talking about sharing a sibling with Loki would be sort of weird. Even though they both talk about Asgard and their parents, and Sylvie is shown growing up in the exact same building as Loki. And before anyone jumps on me that it's only a ship and it doesn't affect anything, it sort of does. Now, do the majority of problematic so-called ships have any effect on real life? No, I don't believe that. But there's a reason I find the Sylki pairing so disgusting and talk about it, but I don't talk about people who want to ship the two Doctor Strangers together from What If, or different versions of Spider-Man together. They are all examples of Selfcest, and you can argue and believe that they stray too close to incest, but that's not the point I want to focus on. The reason I talk about Sylki and not these other Selfcest ships is because Sylki is canon. Writers employed at Marvel and Disney did this and put it on screen for everyone to see as LGBT representation, and that's wrong to present Selfcest as LGBT representation. But should we be surprised that Marvel is willing to make ships that fans see as incestuous canon when there literally is already a canon incest relationship in the Marvel Cinematic Universe? The problem is not so much that it's Selfcest, which is still weird to make canon, but it's using Selfcest with trans characters. If the characters were cis, it obviously wouldn't be transphobic. It could still make you uncomfortable, and it probably would still make me uncomfortable, but it wouldn't be bigoted, it wouldn't be reinforcing transphobic beliefs, it wouldn't be harmful or offensive to anyone. It might make people uncomfortable, but it wouldn't be transphobic. The reason why a lot of gender-fluid people feel uncomfortable and offended by this pairing is because it is Selfcest with the MCU's first and only gender-fluid character. A lot of trans people in general, but more so specifically gender-fluid people, are commonly degraded by being told, you're a man and a woman, you should just date yourself. So now here comes along a show that takes a gender-fluid character and puts him with another version of himself romantically. And these two versions of the character are presented as exclusively male and female. They could have so easily discovered what would feel degrading to gender-fluid fans if they'd just asked some of them. I know some cisgender bisexuals are upset with the idea of the ship as well as gender-fluid people, because it is also often said that bisexuals and pansexuals would date anyone, even themselves, or that bi people or trans people are so self-absorbed that they would date themselves, which is also a valid reason for feeling hurt by the pairing. Some people have compared Sylvie and Loki as being siblings as they share the same parents, both adopted and birth parents, albeit different universe versions of Odin and Frigga and Laufey. What frustrates me here is that while gender-fluid people had real calm critiques of the show and were trying to get the team to address it, Herron came out and refused to address any of the claims of bad LGBT representation and only addressed whether or not Sylki was incestuous, and her argument of why it's not incest is really bad. I don't know whether I personally consider it incest, but Selfcest definitely toes along the line of incestuous relationships. It's definitely something similar. But Herron said that it cannot be incest because both Sylvie and Loki make different decisions and have different motivations. If she wanted to argue why she doesn't think it's incestuous, that's fine, but having different opinions and doing different things are also things that siblings do. Those are not good reasons. Give me a reason, Kate. I beg you for a reason as to why people shouldn't feel uncomfortable by Sylki, but all you've said is it's not incest because they make different decisions, and that's a thing that real siblings also do. You can't say that that's a thing that makes them different from siblings. Also, they literally had a character in the show describe how disgusting the idea of Selfcest is, so I don't know why the team are saying they never expected any fans to have a problem with the pairing when they literally wrote this dialogue in episode 4.
Two variants of the same being, especially you, forming this kind of sick, twisted romantic relationship, that's pure chaos. That could break reality. It's breaking my reality right now. What a incredible seismic narcissist. You fell for yourself.
Now, you've already told me about 50 lies in the past 10 minutes.
I'm not lying this time.
I'm supposed to
I'm
believe
not
your
lying.
terrorist
I'm telling you the truth. She's not my girlfriend.
Whatever you want to call her. Your female self that you have some demented crush on.
You're all variants!
Why did you address this point of criticism about the ship, and not the cries of bad LGBT representation about the ship? Oh, and then there's also Eric Martin, another writer for the show, liking tweets, both for and against the pairing, both for Mobius and Loki kissing, both for Sylvie and Loki kissing, and for Sylvie and Loki being sexual, but also for Sylvie being Loki's daughter. Maybe he's just mass liking tweets. But he did like one tweet in particular that called incest hot. I don't know what that was about. But he also only responds and replies to troll and angry criticism that makes everyone critiquing the show look bad, while never addressing any genuine, real criticism. Heron did this multiple times as well, posting a screenshot of a mean Instagram comment, while still not addressing the multiple popular threads that were explaining the actual problems with the show in polite tones. By screenshotting a comment that called you ugly, and making it seem like this is what all Loki critiques say, is unfair, and is biased, and portrays the narrative that anyone who critiques the show are just trolls and vindictive, abusive harassers. And so many people won't listen to anyone who says, oh, I didn't like the show because half the fans are already cutting you off, because they're assuming you are one of these people. A big issue with Sylki, from a transphobic point of view, and not from a is Selfcest making you uncomfortable point of view, is autogynephilia. As I briefly explained before, autogynephilia is a male's propensity to be sexually aroused by the thought of himself as a female. It's an extremely transphobic belief and term that basically means trans women aren't real and are just men who get aroused by pretending to be a woman. This is about the idea that being trans is linked to being sexually aroused, and a lot of transphobic people believe this and use it as a reason that trans people don't exist, and use it as a reason to say that trans people are predators and perverse. It shouldn't need to be said, but trans women want to transition because they are women, not because they're just men with a fetish. And trans women loving how they look, whether they want surgery or hormones or nothing, is not an act of autogynephilia. But the Loki show sure is giving a lot of trans people autogynephilia vibes. This isn't to kink shame anyone who is into feminization or anything similar. The problem with autogynephilia is not what the fantasy is, but that the fantasy is categorized as a mental disorder and tries to make out that this is the only reason why any trans people want to transition. And it worries me seeing an old team of cis writers make only 1 out of 20 Loki variants female presenting, and then have Loki be attracted to the only female presenting variant. That is what makes me worry if anyone on the writing team is transphobic, or thinks that trans people are all self-obsessed, or thinks this is a fetish of all trans people. Of course, I can't know 100% whether all the writers on Loki are cis, because it's never okay to assume someone's gender, and there could be closeted trans people on the team. And I hate that the current culture of only LGBT people can work on LGBT things has caused so many LGBT people to forcibly come out in order for them to stop getting harassed and death threats. But the autogynephilia is a concern other people brought to me, and I've had to do my own research as I wasn't that familiar with the term beforehand, and I thought it was unfair not to include this when I'm listing ways in which various trans fans have felt invalidated by the show. When I say Sylki makes me think of autogynephilia, it doesn't make me think of it because I believe autogynephilia is real. I do not. It's a transphobic belief. But it makes me think that TERFs who will see the show will see this as proof of their gross autogynephilic beliefs. I don't want anyone to think that when I use the name autogynephilia in this video that I'm supporting the term. I am not supporting the term. The reason why I bring the term up is that I worry that TERFs and transphobes who believe in this term will see this show as vindication for their belief in this term. We have Loki, a character who has been canonically genderfluid in other Marvel media for 8 years, now finally canonically genderfluid in the MCU. We have the implication that all Loki variants are bisexual, as Loki says he is, and assumes Sylvie is, and she doesn't argue on that. But then when fans say, okay, by the logic that all of you are bi, I reckon all of you are also genderfluid, then Kay Heron isn't on board. Funny, how she's bisexual and so is fine with everyone saying all Lokis are bi, but refuses to say it's canon that they're all genderfluid, or even say that she likes the headcanon that they are all genderfluid. She in fact only ever said that that's likely or probably not true. And no, Loki didn't need to shapeshift on screen. I would hope if you've made it to this part of the video you remember me saying earlier how Loki is not genderfluid because he's a shapeshifter, but they didn't give us any genderfluid representation that was different from shapeshifting either. Loki never says or shows he is anything other than male, and no one else refers to him as anything other than male. Every other single Loki variant apart from Sylvie is played by a male actor, and the only one played by a female actor gets to kiss him. This is not a problem with Loki being with a woman. Some people are trying to say you only critique Sylki because you're biphobic, because you're upset that a bisexual Loki kissed a woman and not a man. That is so not what people are mad about. People would not be upset if Loki had kissed a woman who wasn't a different version of himself. If Sylvie had been Amora or Sylvie Lushton, which still would have been weird because, as I said before, Sylvie Lushton is implied to be created by Loki, like, sort of like his daughter. If it had just been Amora the Enchantress, or an entirely new character who was not an alternate universe version of Loki, people wouldn't have had a problem with Loki kissing a woman.
Sylvie Loki fans will do the most to convince you that you're weird for not liking Sylvie and Loki as a couple. The most. I've been told to go outside and touch grass as if I'm the one shipping Selfcest and not them. Gang, fix this. You can't say it's a metaphor for self-love and then tell me they're not the same person so it's not weird in the same sentence. You can't tell me that I'm homophobic for not wanting him to have a female love interest when his female love interest is himself. That's not homophobic. I'm not saying like, oh, he's not bi because he has a female love interest. I'm just saying it's weird that it's him from a different timeline. I'm saying it's mildly transphobic that she was introduced instead of him transforming into a woman ever. I'm saying that it's really problematic of them to introduce that the male Lokis don't even know that, like, a female Loki exists. I'm saying that, you know, it's a very common response for gender fluid people to get when they explain their gender to people, that if you're a man and a woman, why don't you just date yourself? As if that makes any sort of sense. And now they have to watch it in the show that's trying to give them, or supposed to give them, representation. Like, hating this ship is not weird. It makes plenty of sense. And if you're gonna make the argument, it's all fiction, don't comment. Because if it's all fiction, then my opinion on this fiction shouldn't matter to you. Thank you. Good night.
And anyone who would have still had a problem with Loki kissing a woman, then yes, I would wonder if that is biphobia. It just feels so wrong and unlikely that Sylvie would be the only woman or female presenting Loki, but also that the only woman is the one they give the romance to. It is not bad representation to have a bisexual man with a bisexual woman, but the problem is Loki is not a bisexual man, he's a bisexual non-binary gender fluid person, and the show makes no attempt to remember that.
What's something you'll get a lot of hate for if you say it out loud?
I've been having this rant in this room to myself for days, so I have to get it out so these four walls can stop listening to me. Loki is not good queer representation. And I don't know what's so hard about that to understand, because is it a beautiful show? The costume, the set, the cinematography are all stunning. Owen Wilson, lovely addition to the MCU. Tom Hiddleston, all I gotta say about that man is, ugh, you know, like, ugh. Every actor is killing it, and yet queer representation it still is not, because had they actually wanted to give us a bisexual, genderqueer Loki, one Loki variant besides Sylvie would have been feminine presenting. We would have had one scene of like a TVA agent walking one way, Loki walking the other, and then turning around and checking out his ass. Or the librarian that he tries to chat up in order to get the file that he wants, a man! Mobius, who he spends a considerable amount of time with, trying to one-up and trick to get towards the Time Lords. You're telling me that he would not have flirted with him as a means to an end? We're talking about the god of mischief here. Any and all of those things could have happened, and you still could have given us the, what I hope it is not, but what it's looking like to be, poorly formed, not well-written, Selfcest storyline. Sylvie and Loki could still be Sylvie and Loki, and we would have actually gotten queer representation on screen. But But no, MCU does what the MCU always does and sanitizes its queer, POC, and disabled characters for cis-het default consumption. And I'm very tired of it. And I'm even more tired of being told that I cannot talk about it and cannot be angry about it anymore because I should be happy with what I am given. Well, I wasn't given anything. What we got was a 4-line, 3-second conversation that could have been misheard, misconstrued, or just edited out of every other market, and a grainy, like, half-file picture in an end credit. None of those things does a queer character make. You are so good at subtext that every time a crack of thunder and water pours down from the sky, I look at Tom's face and go, oh, Loki misses Thor. But I couldn't even get, like, one queer dollop? One little, like moment? I'm not asking for the moon, the stars, or even crumbs, but you couldn't give us subtext? Do better. Let's talk about this, okay? Because when I made my video, I expected the exact same hate. I expected to be told that this is a biphobic take. Because I've seen it. I saw it on the What the Nell's videos. I saw it on the Wood Mothers videos. I've seen it on every person who chooses to say that this is bad queer representation. And I realized that the reason that I did not get that kind of hate on my video is because I never said that Loki should be with anyone other than Sylvie. Not because I don't think that. I 100% do not believe that Loki and Sylvie should have been together. It was a poorly written storyline. It is not a good storyline. Nothing about it makes me happy. Let me just make that very clear. But I didn't say it because my take was, even keeping the plotline the exact same, they could have put queer rep on screen and still chose not to. But for those thinking that Loki being with a man, or God forbid, no one, is a worse option and a biphobic take, let me just read you some stats. Now, I know it's Wikipedia, so it's not a scholarly source, but it's a great place to start. List of bisexual characters in television. This article's about live-action characters, okay? And if you scroll down farther, I've, cropped it out for you. They break it up into female and male characters for us all. Very nice. Now, do you want to know how many mask-presenting bi people there have been on TV? Because I'm going to tell you. And I say mask-presenting because Loki is already on this list. 99. There have been 99 confirmed bisexual mask-presenting people up to date. And unfortunately, confirmed does not mean on TV. It can mean in an interview by an actor. It can mean after the show was done airing. And apparently it can also mean Castiel from Supernatural, because he is such a great pillar of bisexual representation. So, 99. Of those 99, 40 date or end up with a man on screen. Of those 40, 21 are US television shows, and 19 are international. Now, I'm from Canada, but most of the media we consume here is from the US. So, please explain how it is biphobic to ask for what does not exist. No one was coming at this from a place of biphobia. Instead, it was coming from a place of lack of representation. To see a mask-presenting, confirmed bisexual be with another man is not something that happens every day. It is not something that even happens every year. We are lucky if it happens. So to ask for it is not biphobic. It just is not.
The majority of people who look at this couple think this is a cis man and a cis woman. That is a big problem, especially when you are boasting about how gender fluid he's going to be. And if people do not know that Loki is gender fluid, which a lot of people who watch the Marvel films and shows are not familiar with the Marvel comics, so they don't know that they're meant to be watching a gender fluid character. And some who are vaguely aware that Loki is gender fluid from hearing about it in the comments or from interviews, they're just going to see a gender fluid man kissing the female version of himself, because that's what the show called her. A female version of himself. Loki was assigned male at birth. That means, while being gender fluid, Loki is also a trans woman when they're presenting as a woman. just as I refer to myself as a trans man when I'm presenting as a man. That doesn't mean all gender fluid people refer to themselves in that way, but that still makes Loki both trans and gender fluid, right? When Loki is presenting as a woman, he is technically a trans woman because he was assigned male at birth. So Loki can call herself a trans woman if she wants to. And you just showed this trans woman making out with a woman who you called the female version of this trans woman. How dare you? There is no female version of a trans woman. A trans woman is a woman. A trans woman is female. When a gender fluid AMAB character gets attracted to the only variant out of at least 20 who's a woman, while also never showing that they themselves are a woman, it reeks of not only autogynephilia but of cis-washing. Is that a word? Cis-washing? Straight-washing is a term, so I'm saying cis-washing. There's also a lot of people calling Sylki a straight ship. Both those who ship it and those who don't. And just stop doing that. Any ship with Loki in is not MLM or MLW or WLW. It's non-binary LM, non-binary LW, non-binary L, non-binary. Like, Loki isn't cis and he isn't straight. And Sylvie is also canonically bi. Whether you like the ship or not, you shouldn't call it a straight ship because they are both bi and one is non-binary. And a lot of people in the fandom refuse to listen to any gender fluid person who is trying to inform them about gender fluid issues, whether this other person is cis or trans or non-binary, because there are plenty of trans and non-binary people who don't know anything about gender fluidity, and there are trans and non-binary people who think gender fluidity isn't a real or valid gender. They think that you're either a trans person who is in denial, and so sometimes thinks that they're cis, or you're a cis person sometimes pretending to be trans. And I feel like I have to state again, I would not have a problem with this if it was a fanship. I mean, I still personally wouldn't like it, but it wouldn't be an issue that is causing loads more transphobia. But it is a canon pairing that includes harmful stereotypes and did not properly represent the gender of one of its members, even though the people behind the show promised that it would. It is a problem to show a trans character, and Marvel's first major trans character in their MCU, getting involved with what is shown to the audience as a female version of their male self. It reeks of autogynephilia and transphobia and plays into a common insult that has been used against trans and gender fluid people for years. To a lot of people, yes, the show is fluid phobic. And that should be good enough. As I said at the beginning, even if just 50% of gender fluid people, if 40% of gender fluid people felt like the show was fluid phobic, that is very bad, and there's clearly some real basis for those feelings. If you're not gender fluid, you don't get to have an opinion on this. And if you are gender fluid and don't think anything I just listed in this video is a problem, that is up to you. But you should at least be able to understand and see why other gender fluid people would get upset by it. It's not us being too sensitive, it's us asking for representation that doesn't create more misinformation about gender fluidity, and then therefore doesn't put us in more real world harm and danger. I would hope any gender fluid people that disagree with me wouldn't be angry with me, but would instead try and understand that we all deserve better representation than this. We deserve representation that makes us all come together and get excited, and not split us in half and make loads of us feel invalidated and hurt and get harassed in this fandom that used to feel like a safer space. I hear a lot of, why are you bothered? It's just fictional. Putting aside that bad LGBT representation causes more bad behaviour towards LGBT people in real life, if you believe that it doesn't matter if the pairing consists of harmful ideas about gender fluidity because it's fictional, then why do you care about whether other people like it or not? If you think I shouldn't be bothered about the ship in a negative way because it's fictional, why are you bothered about people critiquing it? Because it's just fiction, right? If you love the Loki show, but you're telling anyone who criticises it to shut up because it's just fictional, why are you bothered? Why are you bothered if people criticise something you think is just trivial fiction? Surely the criticisms wouldn't bother you either, because it's just fiction, right? Why does the show matter to you so much you'd rather protect it and say it's problemless than listen and support LGBT people who critique it? That's in reference to everything I have covered in this video. I've had people tell me that there can't be any transphobia in the show because Tom Hiddleston wouldn't have allowed it to happen. And look, I'm a fan of Tom, but you are naive if you think he had full control over this show when he stated that only 5% of his ideas are used.
I thought it was extremely generous of everybody at Marvel to invite me to sit at the table as we were generating these stories. 95% of the ideas that I had are not in the series at all, but maybe there's 5%, I don't know. You know, I had a few good ideas.
It seems like they made him executive producer more as a move to get the fans happy than to actually give him a lot of control over the show. You're also naive if you think Tom Hiddleston doesn't have privilege as a cis-het white man. And you're also naive if you think that Tom Hiddleston can't be misinformed or ignorant about certain types of transphobia, because he can't know about all of it unless he's extensively studied it, which I doubt he has. He's not educated enough on gender fluidity to know and recognise every single bad stereotype and harmful portrayal. This could have all been avoided if the show had been written by a gender fluid person, or at least had gender fluid writers on the team and consulted in the writing. Because, in Michael Waldron's own words, he didn't feel qualified to talk about gender fluidity, but felt qualified enough to write about it for the biggest film and television franchise in the world, in a show that had over 700 million viewers, who now all either still don't know Loki is gender fluid, or think he's sex fluid, or think he's gender fluid because he's a shapeshifter, or thinks that he likes Sylvie because he's trans or bisexual. And making Sylvie a different person rather than a Loki variant still would not have fixed all the problems in the show. The romantic pairing was far from the only problem with the show, as I have explained in this video. If the show had been exactly the same but Sylvie had not been a Loki variant and she'd been a different character, the show would still have fluid phobia in it, because the dialogue, the misgendering, and the queerbaiting are all really bad. Sylki is not the big bad evil of this series, it's just one of many things that they put into the show that they did not take enough time to consider the ramifications of. I would hope anyone who's watched this video all the way through now understands why a lot of gender fluid and LGBT people feel hurt by the show, and to not jump on anyone criticising it and assume that they're just being an anti or being silly. There is far more of the show to criticise than just its romantic pairing, and all I want to happen is the crew or cast or Tom himself to come forward and speak about the issues people are raising. But no, instead we get interviews on why it's not incest, but also on how Loki looks at Sylvie like she's his mother, but also about how Loki had sex with Sif, and behind the scenes where they want Loki to have crazy bisexual alien sex, as if we wanted to know any of that, and as if some of that doesn't play into biphobic ideas. But no, we get that instead of actually addressing the concerns of gender fluid people who are telling you the way your group of cisgendered writers and director made your gender fluid character was bad and incorrect. And that matters because so many people have only learnt about gender fluidity from Marvel and from your show. And now they're going around with not only incorrect, but harmful information about what gender fluidity is. Bad LGBT representation affects the lives of real LGBT people. But whether it's good or bad, nothing in the show affects the lives of real cishet people. I personally don't think I would be comfortable with watching any sort of season 2, but I do hope at least the team behind the show, who have continued to be silent on this sort of criticism, speak up and address it. And I hope they decide to be better and consult actual gender fluid people at the very least, and at the most, hire some when making season 2. And it worries me even more to see them approaching more characters from Marvel who are queer in the comics, that they're approaching the Young Avengers. They've already aged so many of them down that I almost didn't expect them to ever mention the characters are LGBT, and then use the excuse that they're too young to be having a relationship, and that they don't want to do that with child actors. You know, because it's not like homophobes think that being queer is something sexual and perverse and shouldn't have children involved. Almost all of the Young Avengers in the comics are LGBT, and recently articles were coming out about how we shouldn't expect LGBT representation from the Hawkeye series, and yeah, none of us did. Kate Bishop is a member of the Young Avengers, but she is one of the few members who is straight. No one has been expecting LGBT representation from the Hawkeye series. I have no idea why there are articles about that. The only people we've expected to be LGBT are the ones who are LGBT in the comics, like Wanda's sons, Billy and Tommy, like America Chavez, but they've all been aged down. But if you're looking for some nice LGBT representation, I totally would recommend the Young Avengers series of comics. And also Marvel's recent Marvel Pride Voices comic. While there are still things in it that I don't love, like the little corner of gender fluid characters all being shapeshifters, I honestly enjoyed the comic and some of it's heartwarming. Though it is weird that on the original cover, there's this empty space, and then they later updated it and put Loki there. I have no idea why they originally removed Loki from the cover. I don't know if they felt some kind of pressure from Disney to not include a character on the cover that they have predominantly in their media. I have no idea, because obviously there was a space for him right there, but they just did not release him on the initial cover and then added him later, and I have no idea what that was about. If you're an LGBT person who found something empowering in the Loki series, I'm not saying that you can't or that you shouldn't have. I'm glad you found something to like. I'd also like to recommend these different comic series if you want to see Loki in full action and gender fluid glory. I'd also recommend reading these threads on Twitter, especially the ones written by Star of Asgard, who is a gender fluid person who made threads on what the Loki series should do before the show came out, and then has been addressing how the show failed since its airing. I also have links to other videos criticising the representation in the Loki series in the description, which includes all the videos from other people on YouTube that I have used clips of in this video. It's important to call out films and TV shows when they are transphobic, and especially when it's Disney. I don't know why some people really believe that they really know, they really tried, because it's Disney. They don't care about trying for LGBT representation. But I hope anyone who's now watched this all the way through, and this really is the end this time, guys, thank you for watching this all the way through. If you're still angry at me, I don't know how to help you. If you think I explained anything poorly, I don't know how to explain any of this any better. If you think I'm lying and making all this transphobia, there's nothing I can really do to change your opinion on that. If you're a queer person and you're wondering, can I still like the Loki series even though I recognize and believe it did bad things? Of course you can. If you want to rewatch episode 1 and 2, if you want to rewatch all the show, if you find things very charming in it, I'm glad. I genuinely really enjoyed the first 2 episodes, and I really enjoyed Classic Loki. I thought Classic Loki had a better arc in episode 5 than main Loki did over all 6 episodes. But for me, the show's just become too much of a sore spot. Like, I can't really enjoy the show at all anymore, in the same vein that I can't enjoy Harry Potter anymore. But if you can still find things to like in the show, good for you. Continue to enjoy things, but you can enjoy something and also call out the transphobia when you see it. Or support gender fluid people when they say, hey, there is something wrong with the show that the majority of people didn't notice because the majority of people are not gender fluid. It's not hard to consult LGBT people when writing something LGBT. Love, Simon, and the book it was based on, the author consulted loads of queer kids to make sure that she did things justice and that she didn't use bad stereotypes. And I love that film, and I hope I love the book. I still haven't read it yet. That's how you do something well. No cis person can possibly imagine what it's like to be gender fluid, and especially they can't if they've never spoken to another gender fluid person before. And no, reading some Google definition of it doesn't count. Before I ramble on and make this video 2 hours long, thank you for sitting through it. If you thought that the show was transphobic or had any uncomfortable feelings about it, I hope that this has helped you feel more validated. If you didn't think there was anything wrong with the show, but you now do, thank you for listening to me. If you didn't think there was anything wrong with the show, and you still don't, there's nothing I can really do to further convince you. Gender fluid people, we deserve representation that does not cause the fandom to splinter and shatter. No representation should have been this controversial. I think the fact that so many people are fighting about it proves that they didn't do a good job, because if they did a good job, none of us would be arguing or fighting about it. This is my first video essay that I've made. I hope I did okay. I've been wanting to make this for months, but it's something very personal to me, and I didn't want to record it while I was still too emotional. I wanted to sound relatively calm throughout this video so people would take it more seriously. I didn't want to be blubbing my way through it, which is what would have happened if I'd made this back in June. Hopefully people still watch it even though the show has been off the air for quite a while now. If you want to share this video around, go ahead. What do people on YouTube say? I'd encourage you to like, comment and like or whatever, you know. I do have more video essays I want to make, but a lot of them will focus on my personal interests, like European musicals and non-English language musicals, and why I like them, for the songs, for the LGBT representation, and so on. If you're new to my channel, you can check out one of my previous videos where I explained about my gender fluidity, if you are gender fluid and you want to find more gender fluid creators. If you don't want to follow me because you don't care about musicals, I probably will make video essays on gender fluid and trans representation again. I don't know if I'll do one on Loki though. I don't know if I can stomach season 2 whenever it happens, but if you liked this, I'm glad. I need to go to bed. Links to my other social medias and stuff will be in the description. I'm on literally anywhere you can think of as Empty Masks, you know. Yeah, I don't know how to sign these off.